village of Little Fenham had always been quiet, the sort of place where news travelled slowly and everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. So when the church bell tolled out an hour later than usual one damp April evening, its toll echoing through the narrow cobbled streets, it drew a crowd that whispered nervously in the shadows. Bishop Harrington, the elderly and revered spiritual guide of the parish, had been found dead in his study, seated at his desk as if caught mid-thought. But it was not his death alone that confounded the villagers. It was the manner of it. Miss Marple, seated in her sitting-room at St. Mary Mead, had been nursing a pot of tea when a letter arrived, sealed with Bishop Harrington's personal crest. Its contents were brief and alarming, a plea for her immediate visit, for he feared a danger he could neither name nor evade. By the time she arrived, the vicar had already rung the parish alarm, and the local constable was scratching his head at the scene, muttering about an impossibility he could not untangle. The study itself was immaculate, yet for all its order there was chaos hidden in the smallest details. Harrington's body sat upright in his leather chair, his hands folded neatly on his lap, face as calm as if he had merely paused for meditation. No signs of a struggle marked the room. The windows were latched from the inside, the door locked, the key still dangling in the lock on the outside, a classic locked room scenario. Yet it was the peculiar clue that drew Marple's curiosity. Atop the bishop's polished mahogany desk sat a single playing card, the ace of spades. It had been placed upright against the inkwell, as though deliberately displayed. The card itself was pristine, unmarked, yet entirely out of place in the otherwise perfectly organised study. Detective Inspector Caldwell, a tall, meticulous man with an eye for procedure, had already arrived and was conferring with the vicar and parish secretary, their voices low and tense. "No sign of forced entry," Caldwell murmured, crouching to examine the floorboards. "No gun, no knife, nothing missing. Nothing at all that explains how—" He broke off, frowning at the card. And why leave a card? It seems almost theatrical. Marple, though slight and unassuming, surveyed the room with the practised eye of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human nature in all its guises. She noticed the subtle indentation on the back of the carpet, where a chair might have been dragged, the faint smudge on the otherwise pristine window-pane, and the slight dust pattern that suggested something, or someone, had been in the room, unseen. But her attention kept returning to the ace of spades. It was an old symbol, she knew, often associated with death, yet she could not dismiss the possibility that it was a misdirection, meant to puzzle rather than inform. The villagers gathered outside whispered rumours, each more fantastical than the last. Some insisted the bishop had been murdered by a rival in the church. Others, more superstitious, murmured about a curse that had followed him from his family estate in the north. But none could explain the impossible locked room. As Caldwell took statements from the parish staff, Marple quietly excused herself to examine the bishop's desk and the shelves lining the walls. Books, she noted, were arranged with meticulous care, yet one volume, a leather-bound tome on church law, had been slightly displaced, as if recently handled. Sliding it aside, she glimpsed the faint outline of a drawer hidden behind the bookcase. Returning to Caldwell, she mentioned it casually, watching his reaction. "Hidden compartments," he said, raising an eyebrow, though he quickly dismissed it with a shrug. Nothing like that has ever been involved in this case. Bishop Harrington had no enemies, no affairs, no reason for secrecy. But Marple remained unconvinced. Something about the serene expression on the bishop's face did not sit right with her. People do not die with such composure in sudden circumstances, unless they have known what is coming, she thought. And then there was the matter of the note she had received. Harrington had feared something imminent. Whoever, or whatever, killed him had not surprised him entirely. That suggested premeditation and knowledge beyond the obvious. The first night in the village passed quietly, yet Marple hardly slept. She wandered through the dimly lit churchyard, pondering the strange serenity of the crime scene, the ominous ace of spades, and the odd placement of the bishop's belongings. The moonlight glinted off the iron railings, casting shadows that seemed to twist and dance like whispers of a secret being kept too long. Somewhere in the distance an owl hooted, its call echoing as if in warning. By the following morning, Marple had arranged to interview each of the parish staff individually. The secretary, a young woman with nervous hands, seemed flustered, her story rehearsed and halting. The caretaker, a grizzled man with a permanent scowl, claimed he had heard nothing all evening, though Marple detected a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Even the vicar, usually steady and reliable, hesitated when recounting the bishop's last movements, speaking of routine visits and sermons as though afraid of the truth. It was during a solitary walk through the vestry that Marple noticed the subtle traces that others had overlooked. A faint scent of tobacco lingered in one corner, a brand the bishop had never smoked. A small smear of ink on the desk's edge hinted at hurried writing, and there, almost invisible, was a fingerprint on the back of the ace of spades, too faint for Caldwell's preliminary examination, but telling in its own quiet way. Whoever had placed the card had done so with care, yet in doing so had left the smallest, most revealing detail. Back in the study, Marple considered the possibilities. If the murder had been committed from within, the room's locked state made sense only if the bishop himself had allowed it, or if the killer had known a trick. And the card, she realized, was a message, a signal, or perhaps a confession in symbolic form. Someone who knew the bishop intimately could orchestrate such an elaborate ruse, ensuring the scene was puzzling yet carefully curated. By mid-morning, Caldwell approached, more curious than he would admit. "Miss Marple, you've been quite thorough, but do you honestly think this card can tell us anything, or that a hidden drawer has anything to do with his death?" Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes, Inspector, the smallest detail is the key to the entire puzzle, and sometimes the most innocuous object carries the heaviest weight of meaning." She gestured to the ace of spades. "This card, for instance, is too deliberate to be random. It is a symbol intended to draw attention, yet to obscure the truth at the same time." Caldwell sighed, unconvinced but willing to follow her lead. As they examined the room once more, Marple's mind wove together the fragments she had gathered. The fear Harrington expressed in his note, the impossibility of the locked room, the carefully placed card, the hidden drawer, and the faint, unfamiliar scent. She knew the answer lay not in brute force or obvious confrontation, but in understanding the subtleties of human behavior, the silent gestures, the almost imperceptible signals that betrayed intention. It was only then, as the morning light slanted through the high windows and caught the polished surface of the desk, that Marple's insight crystallized. The solution to this unsolvable crime would hinge upon understanding the bishop himself, the people closest to him, and the secret he had tried, in his final hours, to convey. And in that quiet, almost sacred room, amidst shadows and echoes, she felt the first thread of truth begin to unravel, delicate, elusive, yet undeniable, waiting for the careful hand to follow it to its end. Miss Marple lingered in the study long after Caldwell had left to coordinate with the coroner and patrol the surrounding village. She moved deliberately, her eyes sweeping over every detail with the patience of someone accustomed to reading lives rather than documents. The faint indentation on the carpet, she recalled, suggested a chair had been pulled, perhaps more than once, yet no one had mentioned noticing it, and the dust pattern along the windowsill was irregular, as though someone had leaned there to watch, or to wait. She crouched, lightly brushing her fingers over the smooth surface of the floor. There were no footprints, no telltale scuffs, but the air itself seemed to hold a faint residue of movement, of something unseen yet present. Her attention returned to the ace of spades. Its precise positioning, upright, facing the room, was clearly intentional, yet its presence alone offered no explanation. Who, she wondered, would choose this card to communicate a message or leave a clue, and why such theatrics in a man as disciplined and measured as Bishop Harrington? It occurred to her that the symbol of death might not be a threat at all, but rather a confession, or even a warning directed at someone else entirely. Marple rose, moving toward the bookshelves once more, tracing the spines with delicate fingertips. That slight displacement of the leather-bound tome on church law still gnawed at her. She slid it aside carefully, revealing the faint outline of the hidden drawer she had glimpsed before. The panel gave just enough of a hinge when pressed to suggest it could be opened, but she paused. A sense of caution crept in. There was a deliberate restraint in Harrington's final arrangements, a subtle trap for anyone who might probe too hastily. Outside the study, Caldwell had begun the routine interviews with the parish staff, methodical and thorough yet utterly conventional. He measured responses, noted contradictions, and attempted to reconstruct the bishop's final movements. But, as precise as his record-keeping was, he lacked the sensitivity to human nuance that Miss Marple had spent decades cultivating. She knew, as she quietly observed him from the doorway, that the first clues to deception would not be in the facts themselves, but in the way they were delivered. Returning to the vicarage parlour, she engaged the secretary in casual conversation, listening as much for what she did not say as for what she did. The young woman's hands fidgeted, twisting a handkerchief repeatedly, her voice occasionally slipping into rehearsed tones. Marple noted the subtle hesitation before certain details were offered, the overly precise recall of trivial facts, and the way her eyes darted toward the door whenever the vicar entered the room. It was a pattern of behaviour Miss Marple recognised instantly. Nervous compliance, a shield of apparent cooperation hiding an underlying unease. Marple's gaze lingered on the vicar, a solidly built man with a calm demeanour, though even he betrayed the occasional flicker of uncertainty. She observed the slight narrowing of his eyes when asked about the bishop's last visitors, the almost imperceptible stiffening of his shoulders when the subject turned to the study itself. It was not overt deceit, but it was enough to mark a direction for further scrutiny. Later, she returned to the study, drawn again to the peculiar details that others might dismiss. There, on the corner of the desk, sat a fountain pen, its nib slightly misaligned. The ink had dried in tiny droplets, as though the pen had been hastily set down mid-writing. The pattern suggested a sudden interruption. Marple considered what the bishop might have been attempting at that precise moment. Had he been writing a note, recording a confession, or perhaps preparing to confront someone he feared? The possibilities multiplied, each plausible yet incomplete. It was then she noticed the small letter opener, its position slightly off-centre on the blotter. A faint smudge of what appeared to be ink or wax rested on its tip, as though it had been used to pry open a sealed envelope or a hidden compartment. Marple's fingers hovered over it, sensing that even the smallest object in this room could carry significance. The bishop's orderly habit suggested that any deviation, no matter how minor, could be a deliberate signal or an inadvertent hint of tampering. Her thoughts returned to the hidden drawer behind the bookshelf. It was clear that someone who knew the bishop intimately could access it without raising suspicion, and Marple suspected that its contents held the key to understanding the strange tableau of death. Yet she also sensed caution was required. The drawer might have been rigged or, at the very least, deliberately left to confuse the uninitiated. Marple's instincts drew her back to the parish staff. In the caretaker, a grizzled man of habitual reticence, she detected the first subtle signs of concealment. He recounted the evening with a monotony intended to suggest routine, yet the hesitation in his voice whenever the study was mentioned was telling. His eyes, fixed on the floor, flickered upward at certain pauses, as though seeking validation or reassurance. Marple noted that he had overlooked the ace of spades entirely, a detail which, in her experience, was rarely accidental. Those who are complicit or close to the truth often disregard the very evidence that could condemn them. In the vicar, she found another subtle but equally revealing indication of unease. He spoke freely, yet his hands betrayed him, tapping rhythmically against the arm of his chair, a nervous insistence on maintaining control. It was behaviour that suggested knowledge beyond what he admitted, perhaps of a conversation or a secret too delicate to reveal. Marple did not yet know the full extent, but she felt the contours of the deception shaping beneath the surface. Returning once more to the study as evening crept upon the village, Marple scrutinized every shadow, every line, every item whose placement seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. The ace of spades, the misaligned pen, the smudged letter opener, the subtle dust patterns, all of these elements coalesced into a web of human behaviour, deliberate and unintended, that began to hint at the invisible hand guiding the events of the night. The room was no longer simply a stage of mystery. It was a map of psychological truth, offering small markers for anyone capable of interpreting them. Caldwell, though methodical, remained unaware of these nuances. He had noted the impossibility of the locked room, the absence of a weapon and the mysterious card, but had not yet discerned the layers of human intention that Miss Marple observed so effortlessly. The first signs of deception had begun to emerge, subtle misdirections, faint omissions, and unspoken fears, but the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. As the shadows lengthened and the first lamps of Little Fenham flickered to life, Marple felt the thrill of the chase in her bones. The crime, she realized, was not simply a puzzle of locks, keys, or symbols. It was a narrative woven of human nature itself. Every gesture, every minor inconsistency, every seemingly trivial object could carry the weight of revelation. And though the full truth remained concealed, she sensed that the path to uncovering it was already laid out in the quiet, watchful details she had begun to collect. In that silent study, amid the faint scent of ink and polished wood, Miss Marple understood that the mystery would not yield to brute force or conventional logic. It required patience, observation, and a keen understanding of human motives. And as she finally stepped back from the desk, her eyes resting once more on the ace of spades, she felt the first threads of deception begin to unravel, small yet undeniable, waiting for the careful hand that could follow them to the heart of Bishop Harrington's final confession. The morning sun fell pale and diffuse over Little Fenham, casting a gentle glow across the village streets, yet the tranquillity belied the tension that clung to the vicarage. Miss Marple, having spent the previous evening carefully noting every nuance of the study and the villagers' subtle behaviours, began the process of questioning the parish staff in earnest. Caldwell had set up a formal schedule for interviews, treating them as routine interrogations, yet Marple preferred a quieter, more nuanced approach. She seated herself in the parlour, arranging teacups with deliberate care, and allowed the first witness, the bishop's secretary, to enter alone. The young woman fidgeted immediately, twisting her handkerchief in a way that betrayed nerves. I don't know why anyone would want to harm Bishop Harrington," she said, her voice high and uncertain. He was kind to everyone. Yet in her eyes lingered a flash of calculation, almost imperceptible, that told Marple she was choosing her words with care. I last saw him late yesterday afternoon," she continued, "working in the study as usual. He mentioned something about wanting to write to you, Miss Marple." She hesitated, her fingers trembling over the fabric of her sleeve. Marple sipped her tea calmly, letting the silence stretch. "You say he wanted to write to me," she prompted softly. "Do you recall precisely what he said, or merely the intention?" The secretary's hesitation stretched unnaturally long, and Marple noticed the subtle lift of her eyebrows, the slight tilt of her head, a classic sign of someone measuring the truth against their own fear. I think he meant to warn you," she murmured, almost too quickly, "but I don't know what about. He didn't tell me." That admission, vague though it was, provided the first thread of uncertainty. Marple knew the human tendency to omit, mislead, or exaggerate, especially when fear or guilt lurked behind politeness. She thanked the secretary and allowed her to leave, noting the careful avoidance of any detail that could incriminate or absolve. Next came the caretaker, a man whose weathered face and habitual reticence suggested honesty, yet even he betrayed a flicker of something unreadable. "I was about my rounds, as always," he said, hands clasped behind his back. "Didn't see anyone enter the study, didn't hear a thing. The bishop, he seemed well, for all I could tell." Marple studied him, noting the rhythm of his speech, the slight tightening around his eyes when the study was mentioned. "And the bishop's routine?" she asked gently. "Was it ever altered in any way yesterday?" The caretaker blinked rapidly, a shadow passing over his face. "No, not that I noticed. Nothing unusual. I swear He broke off, then cleared his throat, staring at the floor. Marple caught the subtle contradiction. His voice faltered when pressed on a specific detail. He claimed nothing had changed, yet his instinctive tension betrayed that he had observed something, or had been expected to. Finally the vicar himself entered, exuding calm authority, yet Miss Marple perceived a stiffness in his shoulders and a slight clenching of the jaw. He spoke deliberately, carefully choosing words that sounded casual but seemed rehearsed. The bishop spent the afternoon alone in the study, he said. He had a visitor scheduled, but they arrived late and left immediately. He did not seem disturbed by their presence. Marple tilted her head slightly, noting the emphasis he placed on the visitor's punctuality and departure. "You say he was not disturbed," she repeated. "Did you observe his demeanour closely? Any sign of concern, unease?" The vicar's hands folded tightly on his lap. He was contemplative, perhaps slightly tired. Nothing more. I did not notice anything extraordinary. Yet his eyes betrayed a subtle flicker of hesitation, and Marple caught the faintest quiver of his lips, a micro-expression that often preceded a carefully guarded admission. As she left the parlour and moved back toward the study, Marple reflected on the contrast among the statements. Each witness had a consistent exterior narrative, yet beneath the surface were small inconsistencies, tiny slips, misdirected gestures, and signs of concealed knowledge. The secretary had hinted at a warning meant for her. The caretaker had exhibited involuntary tension when denying unusual occurrences, and the vicar had emphasized the visitor's departure in a manner that suggested conscious omission. Returning to the study, she carefully re-examined the ace of spades. In isolation, it seemed merely symbolic, but in conjunction with the contradictory statements, it became a marker of deliberate communication. Someone had wanted it found, yet others had acted to obscure the context. She considered the subtle smudge on the letter opener, the misaligned fountain pen, and the hidden drawer behind the books. Each object and gesture represented a voice, some truthful, some deceitful, and some designed to mislead entirely. Miss Marple then decided to revisit the visitors who had called on the bishop during the afternoon prior to his death. 2 local dignitaries had arrived at separate times, both well-meaning men, both with impeccable alibis, or so they claimed. The first, a gentleman involved in parish finances, recounted his meeting with rehearsed detail. "The bishop was concerned with the church accounts," he said. "We reviewed the ledgers, discussed the upcoming renovations. Nothing unusual. He seemed his normal self." Yet Marple observed a slight over-precision in his account. Too many numbers, too much emphasis on mundane matters. And did he speak of anything else? Any private concerns, perhaps regarding parish affairs or personal matters? The man paused, a subtle blush rising, his hand brushing an imaginary smudge from his sleeve. I cannot recall," he said finally, in a tone that implied recollection, yet withheld. The second visitor, a distant relative of the bishop, provided an equally polished account. He insisted that their conversation had been brief, courteous, and limited entirely to family matters. Yet when Marple casually mentioned the bishop's writing habits, the man flinched, glanced down, then quickly nodded as if to restore composure. Subtle, involuntary cues like these were her specialty: a flick of an eye, a hesitation, the tension in a hand, all tiny betrayals of concealed intent. Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from these interviews. Everyone she spoke with offered polished, rehearsed versions of events, yet small inconsistencies accumulated like fragments of a shattered mirror. They were voices of deception, each shaped by fear, respect, or deliberate concealment. Some sought to protect, some to mislead, and some perhaps to obscure the truth entirely from prying eyes. By late afternoon, Caldwell had begun compiling his notes in a methodical, linear fashion, unaware of the subtleties Miss Marple had begun to perceive. He recorded times, movements, and statements, yet he had not yet noticed the hidden layer of human motivation, the fears, loyalties, and silent signals that wove together to form the true narrative behind the bishop's death. Marple, however, could sense the undercurrents. The caretaker's tension, the secretary's nervous calculation, the vicar's carefully curated narrative, and the visitor's overly precise accounts were all pieces of a larger puzzle. The ace of spades, previously considered a symbolic flourish, now took on additional significance. It was a message for the discerning eye, a final confession encoded not in words but in gesture. Someone had orchestrated the scene with care, relying upon human assumptions, social expectations, and the very habits of those around him to conceal the truth. That evening, as she sat quietly by the window, Watching the lamplight flicker across the cobblestones, Marple contemplated the voices she had heard. Each version of events contained truth and falsehood in equal measure, and somewhere among the half-truths and evasions lay the key to understanding what had transpired in the bishop's study. Her mind traced the invisible lines connecting object, gesture, and statement. She knew that to uncover the heart of the mystery, she would have to unravel not only the physical evidence, but the intricate web of human behaviour, of loyalties and fears that had shaped the final hours of Bishop Harrington's life. The room was silent, yet charged with a sense of anticipation. Every shadow, every object, every nuance of speech promised revelation for the careful observer. Miss Marple had already begun to see the outlines of the deception, the first faint pattern behind the contradictions and evasions. The next step, she realized, would be to draw forth the concealed truths, gently, subtly, from those who had spoken but had not yet told the whole story. Only then would the full voice of confession, whether spoken, symbolic, or hidden, be heard. Miss Marple spent the morning in contemplative silence, reviewing her notes and the faint impressions left by the morning's interviews. The village of Little Fenham, outwardly quaint and serene, hid beneath its tidy facades a network of desires, resentments, and fears that now seemed tangled together in ways almost too complex to unravel. Each witness and visitor she had questioned presented a different face of reality, and every face carried its own subtle hint of motive. What initially seemed a simple, impossible death had begun to bloom into a labyrinth of human intention, a motive maze in which greed, jealousy, revenge, and fear all intersected. The secretary, young and diligent, had shown an almost obsessive attention to the bishop's affairs. Her nervous avoidance when pressed about the warning meant for Marple hinted at knowledge she was reluctant to reveal. Miss Marple considered the possibilities. Was the secretary protecting someone, or was she herself implicated? Greed might not have been her motive, she seemed far too unassuming for that. But fear, the fear of exposure or reprisal, could easily explain her evasions. Perhaps she had seen something she should not have, or intercepted a message not meant for her eyes. The caretaker, in contrast, offered motives shaded by resentment and loyalty. He had served the vicarage for decades, quietly observing the hierarchies and routines of the household. Longevity had bred familiarity, yes, but also perhaps irritation, a sense of being overlooked or underappreciated. Miss Marple noted his subtle tension when asked about the study. His hesitation suggested a deeper awareness, a memory of an event that contradicted his carefully cultivated image of routine. Could anger, long suppressed, have led him to act, or merely to conceal? She had learned that in these cases, even small slights can grow into dangerous obsession when combined with opportunity. The vicar himself was a study in layered motives. Publicly calm, disciplined, and unwavering in his duty, he nonetheless exhibited micro-expressions betraying unease when certain questions arose. Miss Marple considered the social pressures he faced, the preservation of church reputation, the protection of parishioners, and his own sense of morality. Any one of these pressures could transform into motive if the right circumstances arose. Moreover, his knowledge of the bishop's habits, his access to the study, and his authoritative position all afforded him means as well as opportunity. Was his motive fear, a desire to shield the parish from scandal, or was it a more personal matter, perhaps entwined with jealousy or resentment over decisions the bishop had made regarding church appointments or financial allocations? The two visitors introduced yet another layer of complexity. The parish financier, precise and punctilious in his account of events, had shown signs of overcompensation in his narrative. The obsessive detail of ledgers and renovations suggested either pride in diligence or a subtle attempt to deflect attention from what truly concerned him. Greed seemed plausible here. Financial stakes in the church's operations could easily motivate interference, subtle threats, or manipulation. Yet Miss Marple suspected there was more. Why the sudden emphasis on routine, on dates and sums? Perhaps a secret had been observed, a mismanaged account, or a plan the bishop had intended to disclose. The bishop's distant relative, for his part, displayed a nervous precision in speech, a careful avoidance of certain subjects, and the briefest involuntary flinch when the bishop's writing habits were mentioned. Here, jealousy seemed a likely factor. Family dynamics, particularly among those with inheritance or legacy at stake, are often fertile ground for quiet envy. Miss Marple considered that perhaps the relative resented the bishop's control over family decisions or the prominence of his role in both church and local society. In this setting, such envy could easily turn latent grievance into active interference. Miss Marple then returned to the physical evidence, seeking connections between objects and motives. The Ace of Spades remained a critical point of reference. Its presence was theatrical, yes, but it might also serve as a subtle warning or confession. The smudge on the letter opener, the slight misalignment of the fountain pen, and the hidden drawer behind the books were all threads, waiting to be woven into a coherent understanding of the bishop's final hours. Who had known about these objects, and who might have used them to craft the scene deliberately? One detail kept returning to her mind: the bishop's note to Miss Marple. It suggested fear, an anticipation of danger, yet provided no clear suspect. That fear, she reasoned, must have been directed at someone close enough to threaten him with immediacy. The motive could therefore not be abstract. It was personal, urgent, and anchored in relationships. Every suspect she had interviewed had proximity, either social, familial, or occupational, that would allow both knowledge and opportunity to intersect. The secretary, though outwardly timid, had access to correspondence, schedules, and private documents. A hidden warning intercepted or miscommunicated could explain both her evasiveness and the bishop's final precaution. The caretaker, too, moved freely throughout the house, able to manipulate appearances without drawing notice. The vicar commanded authority and information, capable of orchestrating subtle diversions and controlling narratives. The visitors, meanwhile, each had fleeting access but carried personal stakes that could motivate them to influence events indirectly. Miss Marple drew a map in her mind of these connections. Proximity and opportunity intersected with personal motives. Greed connected naturally to the financier, jealousy to the relative, and fear threaded through both the secretary and the vicar. Yet revenge, subtle and unspoken, might linger elsewhere, a reaction to a perceived slight, a long-simmering resentment, or a concealed disagreement over church governance. The tangle was not random. It was structured, like a web spun by careful, patient hands. Each thread could support the weight of a secret action or a misdirection, leading investigators in circles if they relied only on surface facts. She also noted the importance of timing. The bishop had been alone for a limited window, yet multiple visitors claimed interactions in that same period. The caretaker's rounds, the secretary's attention to correspondence, and the vicar's occasional oversight all intersected within those hours. Miss Marple realized that any action taken to threaten or even kill the bishop had to align with this tightly bound schedule. That suggested planning, perhaps opportunistic, but calculated enough to exploit the small lapses each individual might naturally produce. Her mind returned to the Ace of Spades and the subtle signals within the study. Could it be that the scene itself had been staged to create ambiguity, to suggest an outside hand or an impossible crime? Each object was placed with deliberation, each incongruity chosen to mislead or provoke a specific reaction. The more she considered it, the more she suspected that the bishop himself had known of the danger, and had attempted to encode a warning or confession within the very objects around him. By evening, Miss Marple had begun assembling a lattice of relationships, motivations, and opportunities, each node representing a person, and each connection a potential path toward the truth. The Ace of Spades acted as a symbolic keystone, the hidden drawer a potential repository for evidence, and the faint traces of nervous behavior, hesitations, flinches, over-precisions, served as indicators of concealed knowledge. What was clear, though, was that no single theory could yet explain everything. Each suspect held a plausible motive, yet none accounted for the full complexity of the death in the locked study. As lamplight spilled across the quiet village streets, Miss Marple sat once more in the study, tracing the invisible patterns she had begun to discern. The web of motives was intricate, yet she felt the first lines of clarity emerging from the chaos. Greed, envy, fear, and revenge were threads in the same fabric, interwoven and overlapping. To unravel them would require patience, care, and an intimate understanding of each human heart involved. But Miss Marple sensed, with the quiet certainty that comes from experience, that the maze of motive could be navigated. The puzzle, she realized, was not merely a question of who acted, but why, and in that why lay the path toward Bishop Harrington's final confession. The following morning brought a crisp clarity to Little Fenham, the sort of sharp spring air that seemed to cut through uncertainty and reveal hidden details. Detective Inspector Caldwell, buoyed by what he considered a decisive lead, moved with brisk efficiency, summoning witnesses and examining evidence with renewed purpose. In the previous hours, the bishop's hidden drawer had been discovered, its contents revealed to be a stack of letters, a few personal documents, and a folded piece of paper inscribed with a curious cipher. Caldwell, confident in his procedural instincts, pounced upon it immediately as the key breakthrough he had been seeking. "It's this," Caldwell declared to the gathered staff, pointing to the folded note with a triumphant flourish. "Here is the explanation. Someone clearly tried to communicate with the bishop, or perhaps to blackmail him. The cipher suggests a premeditated plan, a motive rooted in secrecy. I believe we now have the perpetrator." The secretary, wide-eyed, shifted nervously but said nothing. The caretaker leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. Even the vicar's expression betrayed a flicker of apprehension, though he masked it with professional composure. Caldwell continued, oblivious to the subtleties Miss Marple had already noted. "This paper ties together the timeline and points directly toward our suspect. I will be taking the necessary steps to apprehend them." Marple observed silently, her hands folded neatly over her lap. The inspector's certainty was convincing to those unaccustomed to nuance, but she felt the familiar prickle of unease. Something did not align, something that even Caldwell's methodical approach had failed to reveal. The cipher, elegant though it was, seemed almost too convenient, a neat explanation in a case that had been anything but simple. The room, though attentive, seemed to breathe with the tension of suppressed doubt, subtle as the flicker of candlelight across the polished wood of the desk. Caldwell, emboldened by the apparent breakthrough, moved quickly to confront the person he suspected. The visitor whose family connection to the bishop had already been the subject of speculation was called forth. He had appeared nervous during previous questioning, yet now Caldwell assumed that the evidence in hand would force a confession. "We have the cipher," the inspector announced. "It proves knowledge, presence, and intent. Do you wish to explain yourself before we proceed?" The man stiffened, hands clenching at his sides, but remained silent, staring at the floor. Caldwell interpreted the hesitation as guilt, the visible tension as confirmation of his hypothesis. The room filled with murmurs, the parish staff exchanging anxious glances. The air was thick with a mixture of relief and apprehension, as though the resolution had already begun to settle over the household like an early fog. Yet Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the study, on the ace of spades still leaning upright against the inkwell. It had not moved, and it retained the same deliberate presence she had observed from the beginning. In the context of Caldwell's triumph, it seemed to mock the simplicity of his deduction. The cipher might indeed connect superficially to the relative, but Marple suspected it had been left precisely to create this illusion, a false victory meant to mislead anyone not attuned to the deeper subtleties of human behaviour. As Caldwell prepared the paperwork to take the visitor into custody, Marple wandered quietly back to the hidden drawer. She examined the letters and documents once more, her fingers tracing the faint impressions of writing, the occasional misaligned fold, the peculiar spacing of certain lines. The cipher was clever, yes, but it seemed almost performative, an artifice to satisfy a cursory examination, while obscuring the true sequence of events. She sensed that the real orchestrator was still at large, watching and waiting, confident that the authorities had been led astray. The vicar, standing just behind Caldwell, observed the scene with measured concern, yet his carefully neutral expression did not entirely conceal a subtle tightening around the eyes. Marple considered his demeanour closely. He had been the one to emphasize the visitor's departure during her previous questioning, drawing attention to the sequence of events in a way that might protect or misdirect. She could not yet be certain of his involvement, but she knew instinctively that the orchestrator of such meticulous deception would be someone who understood both human psychology and the procedural expectations of the authorities. Caldwell, satisfied that he had closed the case, announced to the staff, "We are resolved, thanks to careful observation and the cipher. Justice will be served, and the bishop's memory preserved." A collective exhale swept through the room, yet Marple felt the tension in the air tighten rather than dissipate. The relief of the others was a poor measure of certainty. The human mind could be misled as easily by satisfaction as by fear. Later, when the visitor had been taken into custody for questioning, Marple remained in the study, circling the desk slowly. She examined the objects with renewed attention, the smudge on the letter opener, faint as it was, the misaligned pen, and the imperceptible fingerprint on the back of the ace of spades. Each detail told a story that Caldwell's straightforward interpretation had ignored. The cipher was compelling as evidence, yet in isolation it lacked the corroborating nuances, the subtle interactions between objects, gestures and behaviours that would reveal the truth. The more she considered the sequence of events, the more she realised that someone had orchestrated the scene with precision. The ace of spades, the cipher, the carefully placed documents, all were designed to attract attention, to suggest motive and direct suspicion away from the true culprit. The actual threat had not been addressed, merely displaced. The real criminal remained in the shadows, confident in the knowledge that Caldwell's procedural triumph would delay discovery and obscure the deeper reality. As dusk settled, the village seemed calm, yet Marple sensed the undercurrents of tension as sharply as ever. Someone in Little Fenham had orchestrated the bishop's death, not merely for opportunity, but with careful foresight, creating a narrative that would mislead, distract, and delay justice. That person remained at large, hidden behind facades of respectability, feigning ignorance while observing the investigation with quiet amusement. Miss Marple resolved to continue her inquiries in secret, recognizing that the appearance of resolution was often the most dangerous illusion of all. While the authorities celebrated their apparent success, the true architect of the crime could wait patiently for the right moment to act again, confident that misdirection had given them both protection and power. The study itself seemed to hum with quiet significance, the ace of spades still leaning upright, as if aware that the case was far from concluded. Every shadow, every object, every subtle trace of human behaviour remained a clue, an unspoken confession waiting for someone with patience and perception to interpret it correctly. Miss Marple understood that she must follow these delicate threads where they led, untangling the false triumph of the authorities to reveal the concealed truth beneath. As night fell over Little Fenham, the village returned to its calm, deceptive serenity. Caldwell believed the case closed, yet Marple knew better. The real criminal remained poised, hidden behind layers of careful planning, waiting for their chance to ensure that any premature victory would prove meaningless. And in the quiet study, amidst the objects left as messages and warnings, Miss Marple felt the tension of anticipation, the knowledge that the final revelation would require both patience and subtlety, and that the shadows still held secrets waiting to emerge. Miss Marple awoke before dawn, restless with a sense that the breakthrough everyone celebrated was nothing more than a mirage. She returned to the study in the quiet hours, the house still, the morning light thin and silver through the tall windows. She examined the room again, moving slowly, deliberately, allowing her mind to wander over the details she had already noted, the ace of spades, the smudged letter opener, the hidden drawer, and the faint impressions of hurried writing on Bishop Harrington's papers. But tonight, something else caught her attention, a small ledger tucked beneath the stack of letters, its cover nondescript, worn and almost intentionally overlooked. The ledger contained entries dating back decades, long before the current tragedy, chronicling parish finances, donations and allocations. At first glance it seemed mundane, yet the meticulous handwriting suggested it had been maintained with a personal sense of responsibility, and occasionally with subtle omissions. Marple traced the columns with her fingers, noting occasional initials beside certain entries, the same initials appearing across years, sometimes in sequence, sometimes sporadically. One set of initials, CF, recurred with unusual frequency, always connected to large sums. Her mind raced. Who could CF be? She recalled the parish financier among the visitors, the man obsessed with numbers and ledgers. Could there be a connection, some thread linking past oversight with present events? She opened her mental archive of prior minor cases, for she had long noted that small, seemingly unrelated incidents often resurfaced decades later, hiding in plain sight until the right circumstances brought them together. A faint memory surfaced, a small theft in a neighbouring parish some 15 years prior, involving embezzlement of church funds, which had been quietly resolved through repayment and secrecy. Miss Marple remembered the details, the involvement of a local clerk, the subtle manipulation of accounts, and the careful avoidance of scandal. She checked the ledger again and found patterns of discrepancies mirroring the earlier case. The same initials appeared alongside sums that seemed to disappear from ordinary record-keeping, suggesting deliberate concealment. Marple's mind shifted to the secretary, young and attentive, whose evasions had seemed rooted in fear. Could she too be connected to this old affair? Perhaps her nervousness was not merely a reaction to recent events, but a response to a lingering pattern of secrecy woven into the parish over years. And what of the vicar, calm and composed yet subtly tense when questioned? Could his actions have been influenced by obligations or loyalties originating from events long before the bishop's death? She recalled the flinches, the rehearsed narratives, the subtle indications that each person sought to protect themselves or others. Now, with the ledger open before her, these behaviours suggested a network of relationships that had persisted across decades. The parish staff and visitors were not isolated in their motives. They were linked through shared history, through secrets that had been carefully preserved and manipulated over time. What appeared to be a crime of opportunity now seemed to be the culmination of decades of suppressed tensions, unspoken agreements, and hidden debts, both financial and personal. Miss Marple made her way to the vicar's private quarters, a quiet room adjacent to the study, where she had noticed a stack of old parish registers. Flipping through the pages, she found a name repeated often in correspondence and annotations, the same initials from the ledger, CF, appearing in conjunction with several parish staff over the years. These were not mere coincidences, but patterns of interaction suggesting influence, obligation, or even blackmail. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of discovery. The crime had roots in long-buried connections, invisible to those who only considered the present moment. Returning to the study, she reconstructed the timeline with these new insights in mind. The bishop had been aware of these threads, of the decades of hidden transactions and quiet manipulations. The ace of spades, the smudged letter opener, and the hidden drawer were not random. They were messages, subtle markers pointing to truths he had anticipated might need exposure. The bishop's final actions had been deliberate, designed to reveal not only the immediate threat, but also the shadow of the past that had shaped it. She pondered the parish financier again. His obsessive attention to ledgers and accounts was no longer merely professional diligence. It could also be a mask for someone with a vested interest in obscuring historical truths. The visitor, previously suspected and temporarily detained due to the cipher, might have been caught in the web purely as a distraction, a pawn positioned to satisfy procedural expectations while the real players remained hidden. The secretary's nervous behaviour also took on new dimensions. If she had inherited responsibility for records or knowledge from older staff, or had been privy to confidential details over the years, her evasions made sense. Fear of exposure, rather than active guilt, could explain her tension and selective disclosures. Miss Marple recognised that understanding motives required tracing connections, and here the past illuminated the present with stark clarity. Even the vicar's careful composure seemed to mask more than mere concern for decorum. Subtle patterns emerged, his interventions in scheduling, his guidance to parish staff, and his influence over correspondence, all reflected someone who understood the stakes of historical secrets. He may not have orchestrated the bishop's death directly, but he had maintained the framework in which such a crime could become plausible, shaped by loyalties and obligations that stretched back decades. As she reviewed the ledger once more, Miss Marple found a small envelope tucked in its spine, unnoticed by others. Inside were notes detailing minor incidents, reconciliations, and personal observations by the bishop over the years. Many entries referenced unnamed individuals, often with cryptic annotations. One note in particular caught her attention. "Careful whom you trust. History leaves marks that endure." The words resonated profoundly. The bishop had been conscious not only of immediate dangers, but also of the enduring influence of past actions on current events. Miss Marple realized that uncovering the crime required not just observing the present scene or interrogating the witnesses, but tracing the long, intricate web of human behavior across time. Greed, jealousy, and fear had been layered upon the decisions, errors, and concealments of years past. The murder was, in essence, the climax of a drama that had begun long before anyone in the vicarage had imagined its consequences. By late afternoon, she had begun mapping the connections in her mind. The parish financier, linked through ledger entries and repeated transactions. The secretary, tied by inherited knowledge and fear of revelation. The vicar, whose influence maintained the network. And even peripheral visitors whose presence intersected with these long-standing patterns. Each person, though seemingly acting in isolation, was in fact part of a larger, subtle tapestry shaped by history. In the quiet of the study, Miss Marple felt the weight of this realization. The crime could not be understood in isolation. The past had cast shadows, long and intricate, connecting motives and opportunities in ways that the authorities, focused on immediate evidence, could not perceive. Every hesitation, every misdirection, and every subtle gesture now gained significance, contextualized by decades of human relationships and obligations. And so the real task became clear. She would have to untangle the threads of the past, uncover the hidden connections among the parish staff and visitors, and understand how the bishop's death was the inevitable, though tragic culmination of long-buried secrets. Only then could the truth, obscured by layers of human behavior and time itself, finally emerge from the shadows that stretched across Little Fenham. Miss Marple spent the evening in quiet contemplation, her mind tracing the intricate web of motives and connections she had uncovered. She had reviewed the ledger, the letters, the cipher, and the ace of spades, and she had carefully observed the subtle behaviors of each suspect. Yet the solution still remained elusive. Conventional questioning and procedural methods had yielded little beyond the superficial. What was required now was an approach that would pierce the polished veneers of deception and provoke the subtle truths hidden beneath. She returned to the study once more, moving deliberately among the objects she had come to know intimately. The ace of spades still rested upright against the inkwell, an unspoken sentinel, while the smudged letter opener lay on the desk, faint traces of fingerprints still visible under careful scrutiny. Marple's mind turned over a tactic she had often employed in her more puzzling cases, the unconventional clue. Sometimes, she had found, people reveal their deepest fears and intentions not through direct interrogation, but through indirect stimuli, small, unexpected tests of their character, psychological provocations, or deliberate disturbances of their perceived control. She began with the secretary. Marple invited her to the study under the pretense of cataloguing remaining letters and organizing correspondence for the bishop. "I thought you might help me," she said gently, "with arranging these letters. It is a tedious task, but your insight would be valuable." The secretary's eyes brightened slightly, a subtle but telling indication of her eagerness to appear cooperative. As they worked together, Marple introduced an unusual element. She asked the secretary to recount aloud all the documents she had seen in the bishop's study, not only from memory but including the hidden drawer and its contents. Marple interspersed her questions with quiet, innocuous statements that subtly contradicted known facts. "And you didn't notice anything unusual about the visitor's ledger?" she asked lightly, almost as if musing aloud. The effect was immediate, though barely perceptible. The secretary's fingers trembled over the letters for just a moment longer than necessary. Her lips pressed tightly and she paused, blinking rapidly. Marple did not press, merely continued the exercise, observing every micro-expression, every hesitation. Subtle cracks began to appear. The secretary's eyes darted toward the ace of spades on the desk, a slight flush rising to her cheeks, and she muttered something about having misfiled letters that should not have been touched. Marple noted these clues quietly, allowing the secretary to believe her slip had gone unnoticed. Psychological pressure, applied gently and obliquely, could often reveal truths more effectively than direct confrontation. By provoking the subconscious, Marple allowed fear, guilt, and memory to guide the revelation of concealed knowledge. The next phase involved the vicar. He had been calm and composed, yet Marple sensed that beneath his careful demeanour lay unease. She invited him to examine the bishop's collection of old parish registers, ostensibly seeking his expertise on dating certain entries and clarifying annotations. "You have the longest experience with these records," she said softly. "I thought perhaps you could explain the unusual notations made by the bishop. They are quite cryptic." The vicar, eager to demonstrate competence and maintain authority, leaned over the registers, his hands brushing lightly over the pages. Marple asked questions that, on the surface, seemed scholarly, but were subtly designed to challenge his memory and prompt self-justification. "This ledger entry from 1947, she inquired. "Would you say it reflects the normal practice of that period, or might it hint at something more unusual?" For a moment the vicar's hand faltered over the page, a faint tightening of his jaw betraying the first sign of tension. I believe it was standard practice," he said, but the hesitation was unmistakable. He adjusted his glasses and tried again. "Though, perhaps there were exceptional cases. Some discrepancies noted, yes, but minor, unremarkable in context." His eagerness to maintain composure revealed more than his words did. Miss Marple recognized that a subtle psychological prompt, suggesting scrutiny of historical action, had forced him to expose the faintest crack in his self-presentation. Then she turned her attention to the parish financier. The man had been meticulous in his previous explanations, emphasizing numbers, dates, and procedures with almost obsessive precision. Marple devised a test that appealed to his particular character. She placed two ledger entries side by side and suggested that one of them might contain an intentional error. "It is curious," she said lightly, "how numbers can be deceptive. Even an experienced accountant might overlook a subtle irregularity. Would you care to verify them for me?" The financier leaned forward, confident in his knowledge and eager to assert competence. He examined the ledgers carefully, tracing columns and calculations with meticulous attention. Yet, as he compared entries, Marple introduced a minor inconsistency, a fabricated annotation in one of the older ledgers. Almost imperceptibly the man flinched, his fingers pausing over the figures, a slight reddening of the temples, a micro-expression of panic barely masked by concentration. Marple watched with keen eyes as his confidence wavered. He had reacted to the challenge as if confronted with a revelation that threatened his carefully maintained facade. By evening, Miss Marple had observed enough. The unconventional clues, subtle psychological provocations, indirect challenges, and the gentle disturbance of routine had elicited reactions that betrayed hidden knowledge. The secretary's fear of exposure, the vicar's careful masking of historical awareness, and the financier's nervous twitch all indicated that someone in that network had knowledge of more than they admitted. Each reaction was a piece of evidence, intangible yet as telling as fingerprints or letters. Returning to the ace of spades, she considered its continued presence. It seemed now not merely symbolic, but an active instrument in the orchestrated drama, a marker designed to provoke responses, to test perceptions, to invite reactions that revealed more than direct questioning ever could. The study itself had become a stage, and she had employed the subtle tools of human psychology to coax truth from the careful facades. Miss Marple's mind began tracing the emerging patterns. The conspirator, whoever it might be, had relied on predictability, predictable fear, predictable loyalty, predictable pride. By gently disrupting these expectations, she had revealed the first fissures in the otherwise polished deception. The answers would not come through confrontation alone. They had emerged from observing the dance between perception and reaction, between anticipation and surprise. As night deepened, the study was quiet, yet alive with the invisible traces of human behaviour. Miss Marple felt the thrill of progress, the subtle shift in understanding that often precedes revelation. The unconventional tactic had worked. A suspect had been caught in the act of self-revelation, exposing a crack that hinted at deeper truths yet to be uncovered. She prepared her notes for the next day, knowing that these reactions would guide her in identifying the true perpetrator. The crime was not merely a question of opportunity or motive, it was a story of concealed knowledge, careful manipulation, and the interplay of past and present. By exploiting the subtle dynamics of human behaviour, Miss Marple had begun to unravel the threads that would ultimately reveal the identity behind Bishop Harrington's final tragedy. The night settled over Little Fenham, but within the study the echoes of subtle admissions and involuntary revelations lingered. The real criminal, still hidden, might believe themselves secure, but Miss Marple now held the key to observing the unseen, interpreting the unspoken, and drawing forth the truths carefully veiled behind years of human deception. And with that insight, she knew the final act of this intricate drama was approaching. The following morning, a pale, misty light settled over Little Fenham, lending the village a subdued, almost ghostly calm. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage early, her mind still occupied with the subtle reactions she had observed the previous night. The unconventional clues had revealed fissures in the carefully constructed deception, yet she knew that each revelation brought with it new dangers. Those who wished to remain hidden often moved quickly and decisively when the threat of exposure loomed. As she stepped into the study, Marple immediately sensed that something was amiss. The ace of spades, which had remained a silent sentinel for days, was gone. Her eyes swept the desk, the inkwell, the letter opener, and the scattered papers, every detail she had meticulously catalogued. Nothing remained in its previous position. The hidden drawer, once revealing the bishop's letters and cipher, had been disturbed. The small ledger, so crucial in illuminating the network of past connections, was gone entirely. Her pulse quickened, but she remained outwardly calm. Someone had moved during the night, altering the physical evidence in a deliberate act of misdirection. The calculated disappearance suggested knowledge not only of what to take, but of what would matter most to the investigation. It was a warning as well as a threat. Whoever sought to obscure the truth understood the investigative process and was actively manipulating it. Detective Inspector Caldwell arrived soon after, as Miss Marple anticipated, confident in his previous resolution of the case. His expression, however, quickly shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion. "The ledger, the letters," he muttered, running his hands over the now empty drawer. "They were all here last night. How could they have vanished?" Marple, observing his reaction, spoke gently. "Someone is working against us, Inspector. They understand what we are piecing together, and they do not wish the truth to be revealed. This disappearance is no accident." Caldwell's brows furrowed, his earlier triumph dissolving into unease. "But who would have the opportunity?" he asked. "Everyone was accounted for." "Opportunity, perhaps, is less important than intent," Marple replied. "The person responsible may have anticipated the sequence of our investigation. They have likely prepared for such contingencies, knowing exactly what could compromise them." Her mind raced, considering the possibilities. The parish financier had access to the study during certain hours and was obsessive about the ledgers. The vicar had authority over the household and could manipulate both schedule and oversight. The secretary, though timid, had intimate knowledge of the study and its hidden compartments. Each could act with sufficient subtlety to remove or alter the evidence without immediate detection. Marple requested a careful review of the visitor's movements the previous evening. She noted the small, often overlooked detail that the caretaker had been dispatched to retrieve supplies, just as the study was last secured. That absence, while routine, created the perfect window for someone familiar with both the household and its investigative processes. She considered the psychological profiles of those involved: the financier, meticulous and controlling; the vicar, cautious but capable of subtle influence; the secretary, fearful yet highly aware of secrets. Each had motive, opportunity, and, importantly, the ability to anticipate the detective's next moves. The disappearance had another consequence. It fractured trust among those under scrutiny. Caldwell, frustrated and flustered, relied heavily on formal procedure and tangible evidence. With key materials now absent, his confidence wavered. The parish staff, already anxious, now regarded each other with suspicion. Even minor gestures, avoiding eye contact, nervous glances, slight hesitation in speech, acquired heightened significance. Miss Marple recognized that such tension could be exploited, revealing hidden truths through careful observation of reactions. Marple decided to use the disruption to her advantage. She examined the study with renewed attention, searching for traces left behind despite the removal of the primary evidence. The smudged letter opener remained, faint fingerprints still discernible. The slight disarray in papers hinted at hurried handling. Dust disturbances suggested recent movement across the floor near the hidden drawer. Each subtle detail became a breadcrumb, pointing not to the contents themselves but to the person who had removed them. She also considered the behavior of those previously interviewed. The secretary, who had exhibited nervous tension the evening prior, now seemed unusually calm, almost too composed. The vicar maintained his customary decorum, but a slight stiffness betrayed a careful effort to avoid drawing attention. The financier, however, exhibited signs of subtle irritation, flickers of impatience, taut shoulders, and hands clasped tightly together. Marple noted that those who reacted most noticeably were often the ones most invested in the disappearance remaining unexplained. A crucial insight struck her. The removal of evidence was itself a calculated clue. Whoever had done this wanted the authorities to misinterpret the situation, to focus on the loss rather than the underlying patterns. The act of vanishing evidence required foresight, knowledge, and precision, traits consistent with someone accustomed to manipulating information, concealing facts, and controlling perception. This narrowed the field of potential culprits significantly. Marple decided to set a quiet trap, relying on subtle psychological pressure rather than overt confrontation. She arranged a meeting in the study under the pretense of reviewing procedural notes with Caldwell. As each suspect was called in, she guided conversation toward the missing items, noting carefully the micro-expressions, the shifts in posture, and the hesitant choice of words. The secretary glanced toward the empty drawer more than once. The vicar's hand tightened around his notes, and the financier's gaze flicked almost imperceptibly toward the window, as if contemplating escape or concealment. By observing these reactions, Marple began to isolate a pattern. The person who reacted with a combination of control and subtle anxiety was likely the one responsible for the disappearance. The behavior suggested intimate knowledge of both the physical layout and the investigative sequence, as well as a psychological awareness of how the absence of evidence would affect others. The removal had been deliberate, intended to manipulate both perception and procedure. Late in the afternoon, a breakthrough occurred. While casually rearranging books in the study, the secretary inadvertently revealed a concealed slip of paper wedged between two volumes, a note previously overlooked, likely overlooked during the initial removal of evidence. It bore a brief, cryptic message, initials matching those Marple had traced in the ledger, paired with a subtle reference to timing and placement. The revelation was almost accidental, yet it confirmed the existence of an orchestrator who had manipulated both the material evidence and the behavior of witnesses. Marple recognized the significance immediately. The missing documents, the ace of spades, the cipher, and now this hidden note were all components of a carefully designed strategy to misdirect and control perception. Whoever had orchestrated this understood the psychology of investigation as intimately as the mechanics of the crime itself. The real criminal was not merely reactive, but proactive, shaping both the narrative and the response to ensure that discovery would remain difficult. As evening fell, the vicarage was suffused with quiet tension. Caldwell, frustrated but still determined, looked to Marple for guidance. She spoke calmly, outlining her observations and interpretations, emphasizing the patterns of behavior and the subtle breadcrumbs left behind. The disappearance of evidence, she explained, was not a setback but a revealing act, a calculated move that exposed both knowledge and intent. Miss Marple understood, as she always did, that truth often hides in plain sight, revealed not only by what is present, but also by what has been taken away. The vanishing evidence had heightened the stakes, fractured trust, and illuminated the psychological contours of the true perpetrator. In the quiet study, she felt the next stage of the investigation begin to crystallize. By following the patterns, observing reactions, and interpreting subtle cues, the real criminal would soon emerge from the shadows, exposed by their own carefully laid maneuvers. The village of Little Fenham had grown quiet under a pall of unease. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the cobblestones, muting the usual bustle of market carts and early walkers. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage with a sense of heightened vigilance, her instincts already tuned to subtle irregularities. The theft of the bishop's documents and the vanishing of crucial evidence had shifted the investigation into a more precarious phase. Each step forward revealed only partial truths, and she sensed that the criminal, clever, patient, and highly aware, was orchestrating a narrative designed to remain elusive. She had barely settled at her desk to review her notes when a sudden, sharp knock interrupted the silence. A messenger boy, breathless and trembling, delivered a note sealed in thick cream paper. Marple's hand, steady as ever, broke the seal and unfolded the writing. Miss Marple, danger is closer than you think. The web is still active. Watch your step. A friend. Her brow furrowed. Though outwardly calm, she recognized the warning for what it was, a signal that the criminal had escalated, that they were aware of her scrutiny and were prepared to act in response. Before she could analyze further, a loud cry rang from the outer courtyard. Miss Marple, moving quickly despite her age, reached the source of the commotion. There, sprawled near the fountain, lay the parish financier, unconscious, a thin trickle of blood seeping from a cut on his temple. A nearby chair had been overturned, papers scattered around him. The scene was immediately alarming. Caldwell arrived moments later, followed by the vicar and the secretary, all of whom now exhibited genuine fear. Caldwell knelt beside the financier, checking for pulse and response. "He's alive, but barely," Caldwell said, irritation and panic mingling in his voice. "Someone has attacked him, and it looks deliberate." Miss Marple's eyes swept the courtyard. The attacker had clearly understood both the terrain and the timing. Footprints, faint but discernible in the dew-soaked ground, led away toward the garden gate. They were small, nimble, and irregular, suggesting someone accustomed to moving quietly, perhaps even familiar with the layout of the vicarage. The attack was precise, targeted not only to harm but to send a message. The investigation was being watched, manipulated, and provoked. Marple crouched beside the financier, observing the micro-details. The cut on his temple was shallow but well-placed, enough to incapacitate temporarily but not to kill. Papers had been disturbed, yet the most crucial items, the small slip of paper found earlier, the hidden note referencing the ledger, had been deliberately left in place. This was not a chaotic act of violence. It was calculated, a psychological maneuver designed to intimidate and to mislead. The secretary, pale and trembling, whispered, Who would do this? We've already lost so much." Her fear was tangible, a mix of genuine concern and perhaps the lingering anxiety of past secrets she had been guarding. The vicar, normally composed, was now visibly strained, his calm facade cracking under the weight of immediate danger. Miss Marple stood, her mind already racing. The attack shifted the investigation sharply. The crime was no longer just a puzzle of past connections, hidden motives, and vanished evidence. It had become an urgent matter of preventing further harm. The perpetrator was not merely reactive. They were orchestrating events, observing the responses of others, and positioning themselves several steps ahead. Each subtle clue, each carefully concealed reaction, now took on the dual function of misdirection and threat. She considered the possible suspects. The secretary, though nervous, showed no signs of violence. The vicar, while influential, did not demonstrate the physical capabilities needed for such a swift, precise strike. That left the visitor relative, the parish financier himself, who now lay, incapacitated, and any unknown individuals who might have been observing from the periphery. Yet the methodical nature of the attack suggested a perpetrator intimately familiar with the vicarage, someone who could anticipate movements, predict reactions, and act decisively in a brief window of opportunity. Miss Marple returned to the study, retracing the path from which the footprints led. Small details, overturned flower pots, displaced gravel, faint impressions on the garden path, indicated a practiced hand. The perpetrator had exploited both knowledge of human behavior and intimate understanding of physical space. Miss Marple realized with a familiar chill that the villain's strategy was psychological as much as physical. The attack was designed to destabilize, to force errors, to manipulate perception, and accelerate missteps in the investigation. By late afternoon, Caldwell had secured the vicarage grounds, yet tension remained high. The financier, now conscious but still weak, recounted that he had been arranging ledgers near the fountain when he felt a sharp blow and then darkness. He could not identify the attacker, but insisted that the movement had been silent, deliberate, and unnervingly precise. Miss Marple noted the pattern. The criminal's knowledge of routines, combined with their apparent patience, implied long-term observation. This was not a crime of passion, but a carefully executed continuation of the bishop's original murder, an extension of the web of deception that Marple had been unraveling. The attack also reframed the remaining evidence. The missing ledger, the cipher, and the ace of spades, all previously analysed for their immediate significance, now acquired a new dimension. They were not only clues to motive, but also potential levers in a psychological game. Whoever had removed the documents and staged the attack understood both the investigative process and the human psychology of those involved. Miss Marple realised that the villain's objective was not solely concealment of facts. It was manipulation, ensuring that panic, confusion, and fear would cloud judgment and misdirect attention. She decided to test the next response carefully. Calling together the remaining household and visitors, she arranged a seemingly innocuous review of the study and its recent disturbances. She watched closely for involuntary reactions, micro-expressions, hesitation, and subtle gestures. The secretary's anxiety was expected, yet she noticed the vicar's controlled breathing, the almost imperceptible tapping of fingers, and the financier's lingering eye contact towards certain corners of the room. Each reaction, carefully catalogued, provided a mental map of the psychological pressures at work. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the vicarage, Miss Marple reflected on the shift in the case. The attack had made clear that the villain was proactive, clever, and several steps ahead. The investigation was no longer about reconstructing the past alone. It was about anticipating future moves, protecting potential victims, and staying ahead of an adversary who understood the vulnerabilities of routine, procedure, and human emotion. In the quiet of her study, she reviewed her observations, each reaction and subtle movement catalogued in her mind. The unexpected twist, the attack on the financier, had raised the stakes dramatically. The villain was no longer merely a shadow of past motives or an orchestrator of misdirection. They were an active, dangerous presence, capable of swift, precise action, and aware of the paths the investigation would take. Miss Marple understood that the final resolution would require a combination of patience, subtle psychological strategy, and careful anticipation of the criminal's next moves. She felt the familiar thrill of challenge mingled with concern. Lives were at stake, and each action, each observation, each choice could tip the balance between revelation and further tragedy. As night fully descended over Little Fenham, the village lay cloaked in quiet uncertainty. The attack had shattered the illusion of safety, and the criminal's presence loomed larger than ever. Miss Marple, undeterred, prepared herself for the next phase, tracking the invisible hand behind the crimes, predicting the unseen threats, and guiding the investigation toward a resolution that would uncover not just the perpetrator, but the full breadth of deception and motive that had brought the bishop, and now the financier, to harm. The morning after the attack, Little Fenham was unusually still, the mist lingering like a soft shroud over the village. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage early, her senses alert, her mind alive with threads of observation she had collected over the past days. The attack on the financier had confirmed what she already suspected. The villain was cunning, meticulous, and always a step ahead. Yet in the midst of chaos, Marple had an instinctive certainty that the clues were not lost, that the criminal's own precision had left a subtle signature she had only to discern. She began her morning in the study, scanning the room for anything previously unnoticed. Her eyes fell upon the ace of spades, which had returned to its place on the inkwell, almost as if deliberately repositioned. It seemed trivial, a mere playing card, but Marple recalled its repeated presence during each investigation stage, its placement seeming almost ritualistic. The card was not merely a symbol, it was a marker, a signal, an indicator pointing toward behavioral patterns. As she turned over each object, Her attention shifted to the furniture, the subtle arrangement of chairs, the way the drawers had been slightly misaligned after the prior night's disturbances. Something about the spacing, the small inconsistencies, tugged at a corner of her mind. Then it struck her. These minor irregularities corresponded to the sequence of actions she had already traced through her observations, the order in which objects were moved, the direction of the footprints in the courtyard, the precise placement of ledgers and letters, all pointed toward a habitual, almost ritualistic behavior of the perpetrator. Miss Marple recalled an offhand remark made by the secretary during the initial investigation, almost buried in her nervous chatter. "I always put things back exactly where I found them. My mother said, disorder is a sign of carelessness." At the time, it had seemed trivial, merely an illustration of her timid personality. But now, considering the ace of spades and the precise arrangement of the study, Marple realized it was a key behavioral clue. The perpetrator's compulsive attention to order and sequence had dictated their method. Every movement was calculated, every alteration designed to provoke a specific reaction, yet constrained by their own rigid habits. She considered the ledger, the vanished documents, and the cryptic note left behind. Each act of removal, each subtle misdirection, adhered to a pattern dictated not only by intent, but also by the perpetrator's compulsive need for control and predictability. The criminal's brilliance lay in their combination of foresight and routine. By exploiting the predictable behaviors of others, they could manipulate perception while adhering to their own internal order. Her gaze then settled on the vicar, who had been quietly assisting Caldwell in cataloguing the remaining materials. Marple noted his habit of adjusting his spectacles repeatedly, tracing his fingers along the edges of pages, and leaning consistently to the left when bending over a desk. Small, innocuous gestures, yet patterns she had observed before in fleeting moments now became significant. They revealed meticulous attention, a subtle anxiety that suggested knowledge beyond mere procedural involvement. Similarly, the financier, recovering from the attack, exhibited repeated behaviors. He straightened objects methodically, returned chairs to exact positions, and occasionally glanced toward the courtyard as though anticipating movement. These habits, once considered trivial, now illustrated a broader pattern of behavior, linking motivation, access, and opportunity. Marple began to map these observations mentally, overlaying the sequence of events with the behavioral signatures she had noted, revealing a clearer picture of both timing and intent. She recalled another small, previously overlooked detail: the caretaker's routine movements, the subtle cues in how he handled supplies, and his own quiet attentiveness to certain areas of the vicarage. At first glance, these behaviors had seemed inconsequential, merely part of his habitual diligence. Yet now, Marple saw that the caretaker's interactions, though peripheral, created predictable windows in which the perpetrator could act unnoticed. These predictable gaps in observation, combined with the criminal's compulsive adherence to their own ritualized actions, created the perfect environment for both the original murder and the subsequent attack. Miss Marple's insight deepened as she considered the ace of spades again. Each time it had appeared, its position had been carefully considered, never random. It had functioned as a psychological lever, a subtle disruption designed to provoke micro-reactions. The card's placement coincided with moments when she had observed hesitation, nervous glances, or signs of guilt. The perpetrator, in orchestrating these moments, had inadvertently revealed themselves repeatedly through their own need for consistency and control. By mid-morning, Marple had begun to articulate the emerging pattern. The crime was not a series of isolated actions, but a sequence dictated by the perpetrator's compulsive habits, an internal logic that could be traced through minor behaviors, the positioning of objects, and subtle cues left as they manipulated the study environment. Each individual act, removal of evidence, staged attack, psychological pressure, had been executed in adherence to these habits. The pattern itself became a guide to predicting future movements, potential errors, and even the ultimate identity of the criminal. She decided to test her emerging theory. Marple arranged a casual demonstration in the study, placing the ace of spades in a slightly altered position and observing reactions. Each suspect, when summoned, displayed micro-behaviors that aligned with her prediction: subtle hesitation, compulsive adjustment, fleeting signs of discomfort. The consistency of these responses, previously dismissed as coincidental, now confirmed the pattern she had discerned. The breakthrough crystallized when she compared these behavioral indicators with the sequence of events leading up to the bishop's death and the attack on the financier. The same traits, precision, control, adherence to ritual, and calculated manipulation appeared repeatedly, forming a clear signature. Where Caldwell had seen only chance and circumstantial evidence, Marple now saw intentionality and habit intertwined, revealing the orchestrator behind the shadows. Miss Marple reflected on the implications. The key to solving the case had been in plain sight all along: the minute, seemingly insignificant details, the repeated gestures, the careful placement of objects, and the micro-reactions of those involved. By following the pattern, she could reconstruct both the sequence of events and the psychological profile of the perpetrator. The chaos, the vanishing evidence, the attacks, all were part of a coherent design, governed by an internal logic that revealed itself to the patient, observant mind. As she prepared to confront the final pieces of the puzzle, Marple felt the familiar thrill of clarity. The pattern provided both a roadmap and a filter, separating the genuine actions from the misdirections, the crucial from the trivial. In the quiet study, amidst the ace of spades, the ledger, and the subtle traces of human behavior, she understood that the threads of deception were not random, but meticulously woven. Each small, overlooked detail had been a marker leading inexorably to the truth. Miss Marple knew that, with the pattern fully recognized, she could anticipate the criminal's next move. The investigation, once chaotic and filled with misdirection, had now gained coherence. By observing behavior, tracing habitual actions, and decoding the subtle signals left in plain sight, she could finally bring clarity to the tangled web of motives, secrets, and threats that had haunted Little Fenham. The villain, brilliant and cautious though they were, had left behind a signature so precise that even the smallest observation could unravel it, and in that revelation lay the key to justice, long delayed, but now within reach. Miss Marple spent the early hours of the morning in quiet reflection, reviewing her meticulously kept notes. The emerging pattern of the criminal's actions had illuminated much: the compulsive precision, the carefully orchestrated misdirections, and the subtle psychological manipulations all pointed toward a mind both methodical and deeply concealed. Yet, while the how of the crime had become clear, the why remained stubbornly elusive. Greed, ambition, or fear could explain some actions, but the relentless cunning, the carefully staged attacks, and the psychological games suggested a motive far deeper, rooted in personal obsession rather than mere circumstance. She returned to the vicarage study, where the ace of spades still occupied its usual place, almost like a silent witness to the sequence of events. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the bishop's private letters, which she had managed to recover from a hidden compartment, untouched by the previous disturbances. One letter, slightly folded at the corner and written in an elegant, precise hand, caught her attention. Its content, at first glance innocuous, contained a subtle thread of connection: references to long-forgotten parish disputes, old family grievances, and hints at betrayals that had occurred decades before. Marple read carefully, noting the way the bishop had chronicled relationships and grievances, not simply reporting them, but reflecting on their psychological weight. It became apparent that the bishop had, knowingly or not, been a repository of secrets. Certain individuals in Little Fenham had carried grudges and obsessions across years, shaped by early interactions with the bishop or his associates. These were not casual irritations, but seeds of deep emotional attachment, obsessions that could, if nurtured by resentment or fear, grow into lethal intent. She recalled the micro-reactions from the suspects, the vicar's careful adjustments of objects, the financier's subtle tension, the secretary's nervous glances. Each reaction had seemed minor, but in light of this new context they formed a map of emotional attachments, fears, and long-held desires. The criminal had been motivated not by immediate gain, but by a compulsion to correct perceived historical wrongs, old slights that had festered over decades, shaping behaviour in ways subtle enough to escape casual scrutiny, but powerful enough to dictate extraordinary measures. Marple began tracing these threads back to a single figure, the vicar himself. He had maintained his calm, composed demeanour throughout the investigation, but each behavioural cue had revealed an underlying rigidity, a compulsion toward order, and a personal investment in controlling both outcomes and narratives. The subtle manipulations, the precise psychological pressure, the attacks and misdirections, they were all consistent with someone who sought not merely to conceal guilt, but to reassert authority and resolve an old grievance. She reviewed the bishop's letters that mentioned the vicar. One particular entry stood out, a passing remark about a disagreement regarding the management of a parish fund decades earlier, involving small but symbolically significant amounts of money and the distribution of certain church assets. At the time, the bishop had judged the matter minor, yet for the vicar, the perceived injustice had lingered. His meticulous nature, previously interpreted as diligence, now revealed itself as obsession, an enduring compulsion to rewrite or control outcomes long after the events had passed. Miss Marple recalled the attack on the financier. It had been more than an attempt to harm. It had been a deliberate, symbolic act, a warning, and a demonstration of power. The attacker knew exactly how to manipulate fear, how to exploit predictable reactions, and how to create tension while remaining just beyond detection. The attack, like the earlier manipulations of evidence, was a manifestation of the same deep psychological drive, the need to assert dominance over past slights, to reshape perception, and to control the unfolding narrative of the bishop's legacy. Even the ace of spades now revealed its significance. Its repeated placement had not been random theatrics but a ritualistic symbol, connected to the vicar's long-held fascination with games, strategy, and the demonstration of intellectual superiority. Each subtle cue, each object's placement, had been chosen to provoke reactions that allowed him to observe, measure, and manipulate, reinforcing his sense of mastery over the unfolding events. Marple's insight sharpened. The motive was deeply personal, an intersection of unresolved grievances, obsessive control, and the psychological satisfaction of orchestrating a complex sequence of events to correct perceived historical wrongs. It was far more intricate than financial gain or immediate revenge. The bishop had represented authority, moral judgment, and, in the vicar's mind, a slight that demanded rectification. The attacks, the theft of evidence, the misdirection, they were all elements of a carefully choreographed plan to assert control over what the vicar perceived as an unresolved injustice. She considered the secretary and the financier peripheral actors in this scheme. Their behaviours had been manipulated, their reactions observed and measured, but they were not the true motivators. The vicar's mind had accounted for their presence, calculated their responses, and integrated them into the broader narrative to maintain the illusion of randomness and misdirection. Even the attack on the financier, which had seemed impulsive, was part of the long-planned exertion of control, a demonstration of how thoroughly the vicar could manage and predict outcomes. Miss Marple decided to confront the vicar in a subtle, controlled manner, allowing him to reveal the truth through his own habitual tendencies. She invited him to the study, discussing the patterns she had observed, the seemingly trivial details that had now coalesced into a coherent picture. She spoke of the ace of spades, the sequence of events, and the psychological pressures she had noted. At first he responded with calm, careful explanations, but as she continued to trace each action, each micro-behaviour, she observed the first true signs of unraveling. His hands trembled slightly, his gaze flickered to the card, and his carefully maintained composure began to fracture. In the quiet of the study, the vicar confessed, almost involuntarily. He spoke of the decades-old disagreements, the perceived slights, and the obsessive desire to regain control and assert authority over events that had long passed. The bishop's meticulous attention to his duties, once admirable, had become a source of obsession. The orchestrated misdirections, attacks, and subtle manipulations had all been driven by this deeply personal psychological motive. The crime had not been impulsive, it had been decades in the making, a carefully nurtured culmination of resentment, obsession, and the desire to assert dominance over perceived injustice. Miss Marple listened, her expression gentle but unwavering, understanding the depth of the vicar's motivations. She recognized the danger that had arisen from unresolved grievances and obsessive control, and she also understood how these forces could escalate into acts of extraordinary precision and psychological manipulation. The motive, shocking in its intensity and complexity, explained the meticulous planning, the staged misdirections, and the calculated attacks. It was a crime born not merely of opportunity, but of enduring, deeply rooted psychological need, a revelation that made every previous clue suddenly coherent. With the hidden motive now revealed, Miss Marple saw the final pieces of the puzzle fall into place. The vicar's obsession had dictated every move, every misdirection, and every manipulation of both evidence and behaviour. The crime, complex and confounding, had been a manifestation of unresolved psychological tension, a long-standing compulsion that demanded resolution at any cost. In the quiet study, she reflected on the extraordinary human complexity that had fueled the crimes. The bishop's death, the attack on the financier, the vanishing evidence, all were expressions of a mind consumed by a need for control and justice, however distorted. Miss Marple understood, as always, that the truth was often hidden not in the grand gestures, but in the intricate interplay of psychology, habit, and unresolved emotion. And now, with the motive revealed, the path to final resolution lay open. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage early that morning, the autumn light slanting through the windows in muted gold. The village remained hushed, as if the world itself were holding its breath, aware that the long, intricate sequence of crimes and misdirections was nearing its climax. The vicar, whose obsessive control and simmering grievances had guided him through each twisted maneuver, would soon confront the truth, not at the whim of the law, but at the steady, relentless observation of a mind trained to see what others overlooked. Miss Marple had spent the previous night planning carefully. Every detail, every behavioural cue, and every trace of misdirection had been reviewed and catalogued. The pattern she had uncovered, the subtle ritualistic placements, the predictable habits, the compulsive gestures, formed a framework for the final confrontation. She had invited the vicar to the study under the pretence of reviewing remaining documents and discussing procedural clarifications. In truth, every object, every chair, every paper had been arranged deliberately to evoke reactions, to channel the vicar's compulsive tendencies toward revealing himself. When he arrived, the vicar greeted her with his usual measured calm, though there was a flicker in his eyes, almost imperceptible, that suggested awareness that the day would not pass as routine. Miss Marple invited him to sit, and she poured tea, letting the ordinary domesticity mask the tension simmering beneath. "You've been observing carefully, Miss Marple," the vicar said, his tone neutral yet edged with subtle defensiveness. "I trust your notes are thorough." Marple smiled softly, placing her cup down. "I find it helps to follow patterns," she said lightly. "The smallest habits often reveal more than grand gestures. One can learn a great deal from the way a person arranges objects or reacts to minute disturbances." The vicar's hands shifted nervously, betraying his meticulous composure. He reached out to adjust a small stack of papers on the desk, aligning them with precision, his fingers trembling slightly. Marple's eyes followed every movement, noting the almost imperceptible signs. The tap of a foot, a slight tightening around the jaw, the subtle glance toward the ace of spades perched near the inkwell. "You see," she continued, "even the smallest disruption can be enlightening. A card, a note, a shift in the position of a ledger. These things tell a story if one knows how to read them." The vicar's fingers stilled, and his calm demeanour flickered further. He tried to meet her gaze, but she held her eyes gently yet firmly upon him. "I imagine," she added, "that these patterns have been familiar to you. Perhaps even you have relied upon them yourself." A tension filled the room, thick and unspoken. The vicar's breath became measured, almost held, and the careful arrangement of papers began to tremble under his fingers. Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft, coaxing rather than accusing. The disruptions, the missing documents, the attacks, they were not random. They were carefully orchestrated, following a sequence dictated by both knowledge and habit. You anticipated the investigator's moves, calculated responses, even guided reactions, all according to a pattern only you could maintain. For the first time, the vicar's composure cracked. His hands fell to his lap, and a faint flush coloured his cheeks. "You don't understand," he murmured, voice tight. "It wasn't personal. It was necessary. He... His sentence faltered, the weight of years of obsession pressing into his words. Marple's gaze remained unwavering. "The motive has always been personal, and yet obscured beneath layers of order and ritual. It is not merely financial, not simply about power, but about control, about righting a perceived wrong that has haunted you for decades. The bishop's decisions, the distribution of authority, the minor slights, all of these became a compulsion. You could not allow them to remain unresolved, and so you acted, guided by pattern, by habit, and by obsession." The vicar's eyes widened, a mixture of fear, shame, and recognition dawning. He rose slightly, his chair scraping the floor softly, a subtle but telling gesture. Miss Marple remained seated, serene and composed, allowing him the space to confront himself. "I see now," he whispered, voice quivering. "I did what had to be done, to restore balance, to correct the wrongs, but I never thought it would be discovered." Marple's voice was gentle, yet it carried the weight of certainty. "Patterns, habits, obsessions, they are revealing. Every micro-gesture, every precise placement, every minor misdirection, all of it has been a roadmap to understanding, if one is patient enough to observe. And I have been." The vicar's shoulders slumped, as though decades of accumulated tension were released in a single inevitable surrender. He moved toward the desk, reaching for a letter, then hesitated, hand trembling. I didn't intend for anyone to be hurt, not the financier, not the secretary. It was always symbolic, a demonstration of control." Miss Marple inclined her head, listening, allowing the confession to unfold naturally. She had constructed the setting, arranged the cues, and guided the vicar's focus so that his own compulsions would lead him to reveal the truth. The sequence of psychological pressure, pattern recognition, and observation had brought him to this moment of exposure without force, without confrontation, allowing his need for order to draw out his own acknowledgement. Suddenly, the vicar's hand clutched at a drawer, a flicker of desperation crossing his face. Marple's eyes did not waver. She had anticipated this, positioning herself strategically between him and potential access to any documents or instruments that might enable further concealment or escape. "There is no need for that," she said softly yet firmly. "All has been observed, all has been understood. Resistance now would only prolong what is inevitable." He paused, hand hovering over the drawer, and then slowly, under the weight of recognition and the clarity of her reasoning, released it. He sank back into the chair, defeated and unmasked by his own compulsions. "It was all the pattern. I couldn't see beyond it," he murmured. Miss Marple leaned back, allowing the silence to deepen, letting the confession settle naturally. "Patterns are revealing," she said quietly, "and once they are understood, the truth is unavoidable." The vicar remained seated, his face pale but calm now, the tension easing as the acknowledgement of motive and method had been expressed. Miss Marple rose, moving to the window, her eyes reflecting the soft light outside. The trap had worked, not through confrontation, not through force, but through observation, insight, and the subtle guidance of a mind attuned to human behaviour. The villain, brilliant and calculating, had been undone by the very patterns that had allowed him to manipulate events for so long. Caldwell entered quietly, aware that the final pieces had fallen into place. Miss Marple gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, indicating that the confession had been secured, that the vicar's own psychology had led him to reveal the truth in full. The danger, the misdirections, the attacks, all were now comprehensible in light of the revealed motive and the patterns that had guided them. In the quiet study, amidst the ace of spades, the meticulously arranged papers, and the faint traces of human behaviour, Miss Marple reflected on the extraordinary interplay of observation, psychology, and patience. The final confrontation had required no dramatic gestures, no forced confessions, only the careful orchestration of circumstance and the unwavering calm of one who could see what others could not. The villain, exposed not by chance, but by the inevitable revelation of patterns and behaviour, had finally succumbed to the clarity of truth. The village of Little Fenham would soon awaken to the resolution, unaware of the careful orchestration behind the confession, the subtle psychological trap that had guided events to their inevitable conclusion. Miss Marple, serene and composed, understood that the web of deception had been intricate, yet the smallest, most seemingly insignificant details, the compulsions, the habits, the gestures, had been sufficient to illuminate the darkness and bring the truth to light. As the first slanting rays of sun filled the study, the case was at last concluded. The vicar, now resigned, understood the consequences of his actions. Miss Marple, quietly satisfied, knew that patience, observation, and insight had brought resolution not only to the crime, but to the tangled human motives and patterns that had shaped it. The ace of spades remained in its place, a silent witness to the unmasking, a testament to the subtle, inexorable logic that had revealed the truth. The morning after the vicar's confession dawned crisp and clear over Little Fenham, carrying the illusion of calm and closure. The villagers went about their routines, murmuring relief that the long and confounding series of crimes had been resolved. The bishop's death, the attacks, the vanished documents, all seemed to have been accounted for, the obsessive vicar finally unmasked, and it was assumed fully responsible. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly vigilant. Experience had taught her that appearances of finality often concealed one last hidden move, a subtle, almost imperceptible manoeuvre that could unravel even the most meticulous resolution. She returned to the study, now untouched since the vicar's confession, and began reviewing her detailed notes once more. The ace of spades sat quietly near the inkwell. The papers were aligned as before, and the room retained the faint, lingering traces of the orchestrated events that had led to the vicar's surrender. Yet, as she traced the sequence of the vicar's actions and the timeline of each clue, an unsettling thought surfaced. Certain reactions during the final confrontation had not aligned entirely with what she had anticipated. There had been a subtle hesitation, a flicker of awareness in one individual that had gone unnoticed amidst the drama of confession. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, narrowing her eyes thoughtfully. She recalled the secretary, quiet and nervous throughout, who had seemed almost too eager to believe in the vicar's guilt. Her reactions during the demonstration of patterns, the ace of spades, and the subtle cues in the study had all seemed almost scripted, too aligned with the unfolding narrative. While the vicar's compulsions had led him to confession, the secretary had moved with a calm that, in hindsight, was out of step with genuine surprise or fear. A flicker of recollection brought her to the small ledger that had originally gone missing. It had been returned after the vicar's confession, but Miss Marple noticed a faint smudge on the corner, almost imperceptible, yet inconsistent with prior handling. Someone had gone through it carefully after the vicar had been detained, rearranging evidence to preserve the illusion that the confession fully accounted for all crimes. Her mind worked quickly, weaving together these subtle discrepancies. The vicar had been meticulous, yes, but his compulsive nature would not allow for such delicate post-confession adjustments. Someone else had acted, perhaps watching from the periphery, manipulating the final narrative. Miss Marple's instincts honed in on the secretary once more. She had always been present, yet unobtrusive, nervous but efficient, observant but seemingly timid. Could it be that the vicar, consumed by obsession and compulsion, had been only part of the scheme? Could the secretary have been quietly orchestrating the broader narrative, using the vicar's compulsions as a tool to mask her own involvement? The thought, though uncomfortable, demanded careful consideration. She reviewed the patterns again, the precise timing of the attacks, the calculated vanishing of evidence, the subtle psychological manipulations, and the reactions of each individual. The secretary's behaviour, initially interpreted as anxiety, now suggested a deeper awareness, an understanding of the sequence, an anticipation of how each reaction would unfold. She had been present at each critical moment, quietly observing, subtly guiding the environment to allow the vicar's compulsions to execute the plan. Yet the true initiative, the hidden hand directing the entire web of deception, could have been hers all along. Miss Marple decided to test this possibility. She arranged a seemingly ordinary review of the documents and artifacts, inviting the secretary to assist her. Each object, each subtle placement, was deliberately chosen to provoke instinctive reactions. Miss Marple spoke lightly about patterns, habits, and psychological tendencies, observing every twitch, hesitation, and glance. The secretary, calm yet precise, began to adjust papers, align objects, and subtly reposition the ace of spades, not out of nervousness, but with a measured, intentional touch. Each movement betrayed understanding, not error, calculation, not surprise. A small smile tugged at Miss Marple's lips. The realization had crystallized. The secretary, previously perceived as a passive participant, had in fact orchestrated much of the complexity. The vicar's obsessive compulsion had been exploited, manipulated to draw attention, to serve as a decoy while she operated from the background. Every disappearance, every staged attack, every misdirection, all had been facilitated by her subtle guidance. The final confession, the neatly arranged papers, the ace of spades, they were all part of a broader design, a careful architecture that had obscured her true involvement until now. Miss Marple confronted her gently without accusation, allowing observation to lead to disclosure. "Patterns are revealing, aren't they?" she said softly, her eyes fixed steadily on the secretary. "Even the most careful orchestration leaves traces, if one knows how. To observe. Some habits, some gestures, cannot be hidden, even when one believes they are acting from the shadows." The secretary's composure faltered for the first time. Her hand twitched slightly, brushing the edge of a ledger, and her gaze darted ever so briefly to the corner where the ace of spades rested. I don't understand," she said, voice almost trembling, though her eyes betrayed recognition. It was just supposed to help, to guide. I didn't—" Miss Marple leaned forward, letting the calm weight of observation press without force. The vicar's compulsions were exploited, yes. His obsession created the framework, but the design, the timing, the subtle manipulations, those were yours. The attacks, the vanishing evidence, the apparent sequence of events, they were shaped in such a way that he seemed the architect, when in truth he was a tool. The secretary's hands went to her face, momentarily covering a flash of panic before she released them, trembling, realizing the truth could no longer be concealed. I never meant for anyone to die," she whispered. "It was meant to guide outcomes, to control perception. I only wanted him to be managed." Miss Marple nodded, acknowledging the confession without haste. The genius of the situation lay in how subtlety had been used as a weapon, how a seemingly timid, unobtrusive individual had managed to orchestrate chaos from the shadows, exploiting compulsions, habits, and predictable behaviors to create a labyrinth of deception. The final twist had been hidden, not in grand gestures, but in quiet observation and patient manipulation. By mid-morning, the truth was laid bare. The vicar had been a participant, driven by obsession, but the secretary had been the quiet mastermind, guiding each event, managing each misdirection, and shaping the narrative so that attention would focus on the vicar's compulsions rather than her own deliberate orchestration. The pattern, once fully decoded, revealed a complexity far greater than anyone had anticipated, a double-layered web of motive, obsession, and manipulation that only the most observant mind could untangle. Miss Marple documented every step, every observation, and every subtle cue that had led to this final revelation. She understood that human psychology, when combined with patience and the exploitation of habitual behavior, could craft deception that seemed impenetrable. Yet even the most careful design bore traces of its author, and by following the minutiae, she had uncovered the hidden hand behind the entire series of crimes. The villagers, still under the impression that the vicar's confession had concluded the case, would soon learn the truth in due course. Miss Marple, calm and composed, reflected on the extraordinary human ingenuity and complexity that had produced such an intricate deception. She recognized the layers of motive, the dualities of behavior, and the interplay of obsession and calculation. The final twist had tested her patience, her observation, and her understanding of human nature, but it had also reaffirmed a principle she had long known. The smallest, most subtle details often reveal the largest truths. As the afternoon light stretched across the vicarage grounds, Miss Marple looked toward the quiet village beyond, her mind clear and steady. The crimes had been orchestrated with brilliance and concealed behind layers of psychological manipulation, yet the truth, patiently observed, carefully traced, and thoughtfully interpreted, had emerged. The case, finally, was complete. The vicar's obsessive patterns had misled many, but the secretary's guiding hand had hidden in plain sight, and Miss Marple's insight had exposed it. The last-minute twist had tested her genius one final time, and once more she had seen the truth that others could not. The sun had begun its slow descent over Little Fenham, casting long shadows across the village streets as Miss Marple walked calmly toward the vicarage one final time. The day's revelations had been extraordinary. The obsessive vicar, once thought to be the sole architect of the crimes, had confessed under the weight of his compulsions, yet the final hidden manipulator, the secretary, had been exposed in a quiet psychological unmasking. The web of deceit was now fully revealed, every strand traced, every motive uncovered. And yet Miss Marple knew the truth of human nature. Justice, though desirable, was rarely neat, and consequences were rarely complete. The vicar sat quietly in the study, hands folded, eyes downcast, his compulsive nature tempered by the undeniable clarity of his exposure. The secretary remained nearby, restrained yet visibly shaken, fully aware that her careful orchestration had been unmasked. The scene was one of subdued tension, a tableau of human psychology revealed through pattern, habit, and observation. Miss Marple's presence, serene and unwavering, carried the quiet authority of insight rather than force. "I believe," she began, her voice calm but firm, "that the entire sequence of events, every attack, every vanishing document, every staged misdirection, was influenced by patterns, habits, and long-held obsessions. The vicar, driven by compulsive need to control and correct perceived wrongs, executed certain actions with meticulous care. Yet these behaviors, while essential to the chronology, were guided and manipulated by another presence, one who understood human psychology, who observed reactions, and who directed events from the shadows." The secretary's face betrayed her guilt, the subtle trembling of her fingers revealing more than words ever could. Miss Marple continued, carefully explaining each subtle indicator, each micro-behavior, each object's placement that had revealed the hidden hand. "The ace of spades," she said, pointing gently, "was not mere ornamentation. It functioned as a psychological lever designed to provoke reactions, to measure responses, and to maintain control over the unfolding narrative. The vicar, predictable in his compulsions, executed actions almost automatically. The deviations, the adjustments, and the orchestrations that guided these actions all originated from your careful hand." The secretary's shoulders sagged, resignation mingling with panic. I never intended for harm," she whispered. "It was supposed to control outcomes, manage events, not destroy lives." Miss Marple inclined her head, understanding yet unwavering. "Intent and action are not always aligned, especially when one manipulates another's compulsions to achieve one's goals. The patterns reveal both motive and method, and in your case, the method guided the motive to outcomes that neither of you could fully anticipate." Outside the study, villagers and local authorities began to gather, unaware that the intricate psychological trap had already concluded. Caldwell had ensured the vicar was restrained, and arrangements were being made for both legal processing and protective oversight. Miss Marple observed the interactions quietly, noting that the secretary's subtle knowledge of procedure, her poised reactions, and her understanding of human behavior allowed her to navigate the situation with minimal visible distress, even as the implications of exposure pressed heavily upon her conscience. Miss Marple reflected on the clues that had been overlooked by others, the meticulously aligned papers, the faint smudges on ledgers, the timing of movements that seemed innocuous but were, in fact, part of a broader design. Even the most trained investigators had been misled by the vicar's compulsions, believing him to be the sole architect, when in reality he had been a tool in a far more complex orchestration. The final revelation had depended not on force but on patient observation, subtle manipulation, and the understanding that human habits, however trivial, leave indelible traces of intent. Yet as she traced the final details in her mind, a quiet unease lingered. The secretary's knowledge of patterns and human behaviour had been exceptional. While captured and restrained, her intellect, her subtlety, and her ability to manipulate circumstances had demonstrated a capacity for evasion and concealment that could, in different hands, escape detection entirely. Miss Marple realized that while justice had been delivered in the immediate sense, the crimes had been resolved, the perpetrators identified, the potential for future manipulation and concealment remained, as long as human cunning and psychological insight existed. She addressed the secretary one last time, gently but firmly. "You will face consequences, of course, but remember, the nature of your actions and your understanding of behavior means that every choice you make will be closely observed, even when you think otherwise. Patterns, habits, and the minutiae of human behavior rarely lie." The vicar, silent but visibly affected, seemed to absorb the gravity of her words as well. He had been both a participant and a victim of his own compulsions, manipulated in ways that now became painfully clear. The study, still filled with faint traces of prior movements, the ace of spades, and the aligned ledgers, had served as both stage and evidence of the interplay between obsession, manipulation, and moral consequence. As the authorities prepared to escort both the vicar and the secretary, Miss Marple took a final survey of the room. Each detail, every small trace told a story that others had missed. The micro-adjustments of papers, the subtle shifts in posture during questioning, the ace of spades as both symbol and tool. All of it had led inexorably to the truth, and yet the lingering shadows suggested that understanding human nature in its fullness required constant vigilance. One could uncover guilt, expose deception, and reveal motives. But cunning, intelligence, and subtlety could always challenge certainty. Stepping into the fading afternoon light, Miss Marple reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events in Little Fenham. The crimes, orchestrated with precision and psychological insight, had been unravelled by patient observation, careful reasoning, and an understanding of the patterns inherent in human behaviour. Yet the lingering knowledge of the secretary's subtlety left a quiet, unsettling sense that justice, while delivered in form, might never fully extinguish the capacity for cunning and manipulation. Miss Marple spoke softly to Caldwell as they walked back through the village streets, her voice carrying the calm assurance of one who had witnessed both human folly and brilliance. "It is remarkable," she said, "how the smallest gestures, the tiniest compulsions can reveal the grandest designs. The truth is always there, though many fail to see it. One must simply watch, listen, and understand the patterns humans leave behind, even when they believe themselves hidden." The villagers, blissfully unaware of the full psychological depth of the crimes that had unfolded, continued their routines. Yet for Miss Marple, the lesson remained vivid. Human nature is complex, motives intertwine with obsession, and even when justice appears served, shadows of ingenuity, cunning, and subtlety can leave an echo of unfinished business. The case of Bishop Harrington's final confession had reached formal resolution, the guilty exposed, the crimes accounted for, but in the quiet, observant mind of the detective, the knowledge that patterns endure and that cunning can sometimes escape remained a sobering reminder of the delicate balance between justice and human ingenuity. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the village green, allowing the quiet evening to settle over her. The ace of spades, the aligned ledgers, the micro-behaviours, and the subtle manipulations all had told their story. Justice had been delivered, yes, but in a world governed by human complexity, she knew that observation, patience, and understanding of human nature would always be necessary. For even when crimes are solved and villains exposed, the potential for subtle deception never entirely disappears. The evening had deepened into a quiet, star-speckled night over Little Fenham. The village seemed to breathe again, its rhythm returning to the ordinary after the extraordinary unraveling of Bishop Harrington's final confession. Miss Marple, walking slowly along the cobbled streets toward the edge of the village, felt a curious mixture of satisfaction and lingering unease. The vicar and the secretary were in the hands of the authorities, the sequence of crimes fully exposed, and the hidden motives revealed. And yet, she sensed there was still something, a minor detail, a subtle irregularity, that did not quite fit. She paused at the old iron gate of the vicarage grounds, looking back at the study's warm light fading behind the curtains. The ace of spades, the meticulously arranged papers, the faint traces of human behaviour that had guided her investigation, all were now mere remnants of an extraordinary psychological puzzle. But her eyes caught something she had overlooked in the rush of the final confrontation, a small, almost invisible mark at the corner of one ledger page, barely a scratch, almost imperceptible. It was different from the smudges and adjustments she had already noted. It was precise, deliberate, and seemed out of place. Miss Marple knelt and examined it carefully. The tiny scratch was not just random wear, it was a symbol, a shorthand, almost like a signature. It did not match anything she had seen in the vicar's habitual compulsions, nor did it fit the secretary's subtle manipulations. Her mind traced patterns back through the timeline of the investigation, through each psychological manipulation, each orchestrated misdirection, each reaction she had observed. And then a quiet possibility emerged. Someone else, someone peripheral, perhaps unnoticed, had left this mark deliberately. A hidden hand, observing and influencing, whose presence had never fully revealed itself. The realization did not alarm her, it intrigued her. Throughout her years of investigation, Miss Marple had learned that human behaviour always leaves traces, and often the smallest ones are the most telling. Someone had used subtlety as a shield, manipulating circumstances from the periphery while allowing the main players, the vicar and the secretary, to occupy the spotlight. The scratch on the ledger, the faintest of signals, might be the key to a deeper layer of orchestration, a hidden observer who had yet to step into full view. Miss Marple's footsteps carried her toward the village green, the crunch of cobblestones beneath her shoes punctuating her thoughts. She considered the possible motives, the faint possibility of a revenge plot, concealed grievance, or perhaps someone with knowledge of the bishop's private affairs who had wanted to ensure that the final narrative remained under their subtle control. The calculated nature of the previous manipulations suggested intelligence, observation, and patience, a mind capable of operating in silence, influencing events while avoiding direct confrontation. As she passed the old church, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the bell tower. It had been the centre of so many of her early observations, the place where the vicar often lingered, where the secretary had arranged documents for the bishop, where small, seemingly trivial patterns had emerged. Could the tower, or someone associated with it, hold clues yet to be discovered? The thought lingered like a shadow across the village square, a reminder that even in apparent resolution, mysteries are rarely fully contained. Her mind returned to the ledger, to the subtle scratch, a mark that might point to a future revelation. The act of leaving such a symbol implied confidence, knowledge, and a readiness to influence events quietly. It suggested someone watching, anticipating, and perhaps preparing to act again, should circumstances demand. Miss Marple's instincts, honed over decades of solving the seemingly unsolvable, whispered that this was not merely an idle mark, but a breadcrumb, an invitation to continue observing, to continue interpreting the hidden currents of human behaviour. The night air, crisp and fragrant with the scent of late autumn leaves, seemed to hum with quiet possibility. She thought of the villagers, unaware of the invisible layers of orchestration that had guided their lives over the past weeks. They believed the crimes solved, the confessions complete, the justice served. And yet Miss Marple, attuned to the subtle nuances of human nature, recognized that truth is rarely singular or final. The real world is layered, multifaceted, and full of shadows that conceal more than they reveal. A faint rustle behind her drew her attention. For a brief moment she sensed a presence, perhaps the lingering step of someone retreating, perhaps the whisper of wind through the trees, but it was enough to reinforce her intuition. Someone had been watching, and perhaps still was. The scratch in the ledger, minor as it seemed, had opened a doorway in her mind. She would not ignore it. Observation, patience, and attention to subtle detail were the tools she had always relied upon, and she knew that in Little Fenham the next mystery could be quietly unfolding even as the villagers slept. As she continued along the lane, the outline of the vicarage fading behind her, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. The case had been extraordinary, resolved with precision, yet the final twist, the mark, the subtle evidence of a hidden hand, reminded her that mysteries never truly end. They evolve, shift, and sometimes whisper hints of new challenges just beyond immediate perception. For those with the eyes to see, the mind to interpret, and the patience to follow, the work of discovery never ceases. Miss Marple reached the edge of the village, the distant lights of the cottages glowing softly in the night. She paused, reflecting on the intricacy of human motives, the subtlety of deception, and the layers of observation that had brought resolution to the crimes. And yet, the scratch, the faint symbol, and the lingering possibility of another hidden presence left her mind alight with curiosity. It was a reminder that the world is rarely as simple as it appears, that resolution is often temporary, and that the keen eye, the attentive mind, and the patience to observe remain essential tools for any detective who seeks the truth. With a quiet sigh, Miss Marple adjusted her coat against the cool night and began walking beyond the village toward the distant fields. The case of Bishop Harrington's final confession was formally concluded, the guilty had been exposed, and the patterns had been revealed. And yet, in the quiet corners of her mind, a question remained. Subtle, persistent, and unyielding. Who had left the mark on the ledger? What was its meaning? And might it point toward a challenge yet to come? The stars overhead gleamed with an indifferent brilliance as Miss Marple's figure receded into the night, leaving Little Fenham to its slumbering peace. The ace of spades, the patterns, the scratches, and the faint traces of human behaviour all hinted that the story was not entirely over. A mystery never truly ends. It only waits for the eyes to notice, the mind to interpret, and the patient detective to follow the trail once more. And for Miss Marple, the path of observation, insight, and understanding would continue, quietly, inexorably, into whatever mysteries lay ahead.